Hello, Shirley Adams back, and it's a sheer pleasure to visit with you on program number 9 of the Sewing Connection Series 2. Sheers for blouses, dresses, formal wear include chiffons or georgettes or organza or any of the very thin fabrics, both transparent and opaque. They can be quite a challenge, requiring extra thought, care in handling, and a lot of experimenting with the scraps to make decisions. Now, as you're in the store, some of those that you might find will be like this. And this is going to be one of the easier ones. Now, this is a very sheer one. You can see my hand through it. You can read through it. So it's sheer. Because of this, it's going to be worn over something else. This is just an over blouse that goes over sort of a slip dress. And so it doesn't matter that you can see through. It's fine. But it's going to be easier to work with than some of them because it is crisp. And that's going to be a little bit of a help. This one, on the other hand, is even more transparent, but this one also is very soft, and that makes it doubly hard. What I would like to do with this very soft, drapey one is find the easiest pattern possible and to have as few seams as possible. In fact, what happened with this, with both of these, is seams can be combined. Notice how there are no seams anywhere because you want to eliminate all you can. The only seam in this whole blouse is under the arm on each side. Other than that, it's all cut as one piece. That was the easiest way to do it in order to avoid those seams, because when it's this sheer, you really don't want to look through and see seams anyway. They aren't too pretty. So think about that, what kind of pattern you're going to put with it because of the sheerness of it. Here's one that is also sheer, but it was made less sheer, or at least it was made opaque by putting a whole lot of pleats in it. And with these pleats, you're not looking through just one layer of fabric. You're looking through 3 layers of fabric as it's folded back and forth. So this makes it wearable, even though it is a sheer fabric, and even though it would be almost transparent, would you not be seeing through so many layers. Something else you want to consider with some of these layers is what kind of an interfacing. And here I didn't use a separate interfacing. In this one, I decided it was better in the collar and cuffs to just use a 3rd layer of that same fabric, because that's what showed the least and that's what made the best effect. So every piece is a different case all unto itself. Now this one is also very sheer, and with this one, you can see the hanger through it here, very sheer in the black parts. This one's going to be worn over a slip dress also, so it's kind of for evening wear. It makes a nice feminine fashion. Notice how drapey it is. Notice that it just drapes. It falls very nicely, very softly. This peplum at the waist is very graceful. And so this is the nice way to use these soft ones that are so drapey. Go along with the fabric and don't try to fight it. Here's another one. I'll show you how to do this one in a little while. This one is also a sheer. It's not quite as transparent as the others, but what it is a t-shirt really, and it's a copy of a $450 t-shirt I saw, but I'll show you how to do something of this sort, making these kind of unusual seams in it. Because this one needed something extra, it's underlined, and so is this one down here for different reasons, but I'll tell you about those in a little bit. So these are the type things you'll see in the store, and then you need to consider how you're going to handle them before you leave that store. Be sure that you have a supply of the fine needles, the finest thread you can find. You don't want coarse thread with these. You want everything in character with the fabric, so look for those notions and whatever it is you need in the store, and then when you get it home and are ready to do some cutting, here are the things that you're going to find difficult. One of those fabrics, you know, I said was crisp, and because it was crisp, as this one is, it's going to be fairly easy to cut. It stays in place. It's sort of stiff, starchy almost. Because of this stiffness, you can cut it. It won't move. This one, on the other hand, is very difficult to cut because it is so soft and floaty that it moves around on the table and you can't really get under it too easily with the shears. It keeps scooting away from you and moving, and so it's difficult. And if you use a fabric like this, you will therefore have to put a lot of pins in it, put weights on it, do whatever, work with the surface, maybe even a textury surface instead of a smooth one so that it holds in place. If it seems absolutely impossible, here's another thought. What about underlining the whole thing? And that means that you put a crisp fabric with this soft fabric, which is what I chose to do on the blouse that I have made from it. And the reason I chose, 2 reasons I chose to do it that way. I both wanted to make this opaque instead of transparent, but also I wanted it to have a degree of crispness because it's an over blouse, and I wanted that stand out quality that it has there in the peplum area below the waist. So for these reasons, I did underline it with a crisp organza, and it worked out very nicely. But what was difficult about it is getting that organza and the upper layer together. I finally decided the easiest way to cut this, because it was so slippery, was to cut out the organza layer first. And after I had those pattern pieces cut out of this layer, then it was very easy to use a glue stick and to glue it on the back side of the very soft one that slid around. If I would just glue these on the back side, then I didn't even need to use the pattern. I could just glue them all there with a glue stick, just a little bit around the edges so that it held it in place, and cut them out, and this was a little bit easier. So you might have to resort to unusual methods that you don't read about anywhere, but you find through common sense and through a little experimenting, hey, it works, so I better go ahead with it. So think about all these different problems you might have and see what you can do to resolve them. Okay, in the area of interfacing, then I have a few of them down here on the table, and let's look to see what's available. In the interfacing departments, you can find a lot of sew-in shears. The organza that I just used was one of them, and this organza actually I used in this garment for an underlining, but in another garment it was the skirt of a wedding gown, so it also goes very easily for the over layers if you want that soft, floaty sheer look on top. These two are strictly sew-in interfacings. They would not be used in any way as a garment, as a fashion fabric. They are strictly the underlining, the interfacing layers. But they are very sheer, they're crisp, they do a really nice job inside of some of these shears. There are times when you might want to put a fusible interfacing in too. Now if you think this one that's on the table is a little bit wrinkly looking, I can't press it out to make it look more decent, or I'll have a new cover on the ironing board, because it is a fusible. So if you wrinkle it, try to keep this in your supply all nicely pressed out, all nicely folded and or rolled perhaps, but don't let it get wrinkled, because there's nothing you can do to smooth it out with an iron anyway. But notice these are both sheer interfacings, and I have them, I'll put them over my hand so you can see the difference. They are both sheer fusible interfacings, but notice how this one over here is so sheer it's absolutely transparent. It's really the most sheer one I've seen. This is the heavier one, one of the earlier ones that was on the market, and these are mainly kind of fusible tricots. They're knit, so they do have a little give with them and they work nicely, but there are about 4 or 5 of these on the market right now, and look through those to see how sheer you want it and how well it's going to work. I kind of like to buy a little bit of each one to have it at home so that I can experiment with it whenever I need to. Then you don't always have to have these fabrics just as used just as I did here. You can put other things with them, other fabrics, put other details on them. With this one, both of these, remember I said that I tried to use as few seams as possible. Now these are both over blouses, so it doesn't matter that they're completely transparent, but the seaming is kind of nice because it isn't too pretty to see those seams. For that same reason, in this one back here that's only in one layer, on this one I also used, to get as few seams as possible, I also only have seams under the arms, because I really am not fond of seeing those seams that come around the arm's eye and in all the transparent places, so I tried to do something about that. You also need to think on these about what kind of fastenings you're going to have. I decided instead of trying to make buttonholes in this, button loops are going to be the best, and you might make your own out of bias, or you might also just use those elastic loops that you can buy by the yard in the bridal departments or in somewhere in the notion departments in the fabric shops, but that might be the easiest way to take care of this problem. Then these that are still here, this was kind of a fun one. Actually, when I got this, I'm just sort of going through problems, you understand, so we're going to drift back and forth a little bit as I kind of explore these problems. I haven't made the dress yet that goes with this, but it was a coordinate fabric. It was this very sheer fabric, the see-through fabric, and with it came this silky fabric. And so what I am going to do is make a dress out of this, and this is the jacket to wear over that dress. Now, my first thought was to have this quilted, because I found by working with this scrap of fabric that it quilts beautifully, to put some batting in between the layers and put something else in the background, and I found that it really does a nice job of quilting. This one also I used metallic thread on because I wanted to do it for an evening project perhaps and make it a little dressy. I was going to do a jacket out of it, It ended up not being a jacket after all, but that's what it started out to be. But anyway, this was going to be the same thing. Well, here's why I couldn't do that, even though I had planned it. Look what happens when you put this over the batting. The colors just kind of disappear. They sort of fade out. They don't do anything. They have very little impact. It works better not over something light like this, but over something else dark. If, for instance, I have 2 layers of this fabric, I'll just slide it down to show you what 2 layers look like. It immediately gets a little bit more personality. You can see a little bit more here. It's more colorful. You can see the pattern, the design in it more distinctly. So because of that, I abandoned my idea, my original thought of making this a quilted jacket, and I instead just went with an underline jacket. What I have on the inside is a black fabric, and because of that black fabric, it shows up much, much better. So that's why I said you change your mind sometimes in the middle of the project when you discover that one way doesn't really work the way you had anticipated, and maybe you better do something different with it. I like it very much the way it is. I'll get around to the dress one of these days. In the meantime, it's going to be just a blouse to wear with a black skirt or something until I do get the dress made. One of the nice parts about having such versatile things that you can wear them in a lot of different ways. Now here's the one that I said I saw in a magazine with a price tag of $450 on it. And I had already made up the other shears. This was the only one I still had in my sewing room late one night as I decided I'm going to make that up right now when I saw the picture in the magazine. And what it was just a t-shirt for $450 out of a sheer fabric. But I noticed as I looked at that picture in the magazine that you could see very, very fine seams. On a former program, I showed doing a rolled hem, and I decided as I looked at those seams in the magazine that you could see through the fabric, why that is a rolled hem done on a serger. So I decided to do this the same way, and let's see how that works. Let's go over to the serger and see what happens if I do that. So just using this is already set up for a rolled hem. I've put the right foot on it, and we'll just go through this. Now naturally what I did when I did this on the t-shirt there, on the finished garment, naturally what I did there was to not use contrasting threads as I have here. I instead used the very same color, and I made sure that that color that I used instead of being black was gray, but also it was one of the very fine ones. One of the woolly nylon type things that are very fine, but they're strong, and so that would do a better job. These are heavier threads that I have in right now just so that you can see the contrast, and this wouldn't make that pretty a seam. But you can see how that rolled hem is a good idea, not only because it makes a very fine seam, but also consider how strong that is, because actually it took a pretty big bite in the fabric as this seam was being sewn. It actually has enclosed there probably about as much as, maybe a good 1/4 of an inch or more from each seam allowance, and it's all rolled up then inside this seam. But that makes it quite strong, the fact that you don't have it all just one raw edge as you would on the sewing machine. It would be a whole lot less there. So this makes it strong, as well as something that looks very nice. Now I used that same rolled hem for all the edges, which means, of course, as you look at this, how simple it is. The dropped shoulders and the sleeves are set in down there. The side seams, that's about all there is to it. So this meant very few minutes in making these. This is sort of like thinking, oh, it's 5 o'clock and I'm going out at 6. I better make myself something to wear. It's almost to that point. But then here around the edge I do have the rolled hem. So this, of course, is just one layer of fabric, but with the same rolled hem, and it works out beautifully either way. Same process on the machine. Didn't change the serger in any other way. I just still had it set up for the same rolled hem, but whether you do the seams or the hem, either way it worked equally well. What else I have on this blouse is a bound neckline. Now I must admit I didn't do an exact copy of the one that I saw, because in the magazine they had the same rolled hem edge around the neck, and I decided that I would rather have something a little bit more substantial. I would rather have this bound edge. So that's done on the sewing machine, and let me show you how to do that if you decide to do one on the sewing machine. Now what else you're going to find out when you sew with these fabrics is possibly that I'll just do this first on a scrap of this fabric, And before I start sewing on this, I want to set it. If you have this capability on your machine, be sure you do set it for a light woven fabric. It's about the lightest you can get. So be sure you do set your machine for that. And what that means is that the tension will be different. The stitches will be smaller. And when I do this sewing, what I want to find out is, will those seams pucker? Because if they pucker, then I want to do something different about it. Now this has adjusted itself somewhat, so they don't pucker too dreadfully. There are small stitches and that helps, so there aren't puckers that way when the stitches are small, but there is a little bit here. I might find it a little bit better if instead of doing it this way with the multi-purpose foot there, I might find it a little bit better if I would change that foot. So use whatever feet are at your disposal, and what I'm putting in here is a different foot, and what this foot is one that has just a little hole right in the center of it. That means it's a straight stitch foot, and because of that it's going to hold that fabric down more firmly and it won't allow as much play in it, and possibly if I do a seam with that foot I won't have any puckering. It might also be a good idea to override the computer, and instead of having the tension that they have set there, I might find that I want a little less tension there, so I might change that a little bit, or I might do whatever it takes. Experiment around a little bit and see what happens. I might also want to, instead of just letting it sew itself, besides using this straight stitch foot, I might want to hold it in tension as I'm sewing it. Hold it so that the fabric's taut, instead of just letting it go by itself. Now don't stretch it or don't pull it through the machine, or you can cause a problem with your machine. I'm not pulling it through the machine, I'm just holding it a little taut as I sew, and sometimes this helps and makes it look better. You might also try on a scrap though to see whether this is going to be the best direction. If you have a little bit more, get a little extra to begin with so that you can experiment somewhat with the scraps. But if you have a little bit of extra, cut off a few pieces here and see, is it going to be better stitched on the lengthwise grain, which is what I have here, and which is what you'd usually have. Ordinarily you cut things with the grain arrow going up and down the parallel with the selvage. Here's the selvage over here, so you can see I stitched parallel. Sometimes when you find there's a lot of puckering doing this parallel with the selvage, you might want to try doing it on the crosswise grain and see if that works any better. If it does, what that would mean is you would cut out your whole garment crosswise instead of lengthwise, and perhaps that will do the job better. Sometimes if you do it crosswise on these soft fabrics, they all fall softer, and this one I did not use any tension with my hands. I did not pull it out tautly at all. I let it go by itself, but see how there is no puckering? This is doing it on the crosswise, and that might be your best bet. So think about what are the possibilities. You might also do it on bias, but on the bias you're going to have a lot of problems with this unless you use a pattern that is specifically meant for that, because of course the bias areas are going to stretch down longer, and it could cause a lot of problems in the way it fits. But think it through. Do things because you have thought it through and you know it's going to work that way. So make some wise decisions on that. Then I'm going to put that neckline on that I told you about, and sometimes it's easier if it's really slippery fabric to cut this bias, because that is a bias neckline that was on the blouse. Sometimes it's easier, and you can see by the stretch that it's bias, but sometimes it's easier to cut this and press it in place so that it holds more firmly as you're doing the job, as you're stitching it onto the neckline. Other times I find it easier to just cut my strip of bias, and this is kind of a wide piece of bias really. It's about 2 inches or possibly even a little bit more than 2 inches wide, because it's going to be used double. I'm going to put the two raw edges together, and I'm going to then, I've just simulated a little round neckline here by cutting out a piece of fabric with a little semicircle in it. So what I'm doing is putting the two raw edges of this bias against the one raw edge of the neckline of the blouse, and I've put a few pins here to hold it together, and I'm going to stitch that. Now ordinarily when you do stitching you're going to make this a 5/8 inch seam, but not with this. I just have to trim it off unless it already has a high neck, too high in fact, and you want it to be down a little bit lower so that you won't be choking in it. But this one I have determined already has a low enough neck that I won't have to worry about that. I need to get these threads under the foot or through the little slot there. Okay, so I'm going to make a narrow seam here is what I'm getting at instead of a 5/8. I'm only going to make this, a little bit less actually than the width of the presser foot. So as I stitch around here, I'm actually going to be stitching on all grains because this is around a curve. So some of it will be lengthwise, some crosswise, some bias, and it probably won't create too much of a problem any direction because here I have 3 layers of fabric instead of 2, and so with the extra heaviness there, the extra fabric, it's likely that it will turn out just fine. So sometimes you have seen me stitch over pins. I wouldn't advise it in shears. It's not a good idea. They can really get hung up in the feed teeth as you go past, so it isn't a good idea. I am now past the blouse, and so we need to do a little back stitching and to secure it, and then I'm going to take it out of the machine and we're going to finish this up in another way. Let me show you why. Getting back to that blouse, it had a tie on the back of the neck. This is how it was secured. This was the only fastening on the whole blouse, just this little tie. And notice how that is, just a continuation of the same strip of fabric that came around the neck. So this is what we need to do now, the tie. And to do that, out of the same bias, all in one piece, I'm going to have to refold this a little bit. I'll refold it so that here I have the 2 layers as I was putting them on the blouse. I'll refold this so that the fold comes over and not quite to the raw edges because I want to stitch real close to the fold, but I want those raw edges to be out a little bit longer. So I'm going to put this in. I'll just put a pin here to hold it temporarily until I get it under the foot of the machine. Okay, I want to start stitching here then, and after I have a couple of stitches in and back stitch, then I can take the pins out. And then you just stop whenever you need to, and this is another time you want to put the needle down so it holds the fabric whenever you do stop so that it won't end up in the up position, at which time you'd have no control. Okay, and then I'm just stitching really close to the fold of the fabric. You see how close that is to the fold, and yet the 2 raw edges are extending out behind it or beyond it so that there will be a lot of security there. They won't ravel out at all. And then when we get to the very end, and I'm just going to cut this off a little short, as we get to the end, and we'll cut it off, the threads. I'll also cut off the fabric since I just determined I didn't want them that long. And then take any of the turners that are on the market to turn this tube right side out. What I'm going to use on this tube is this fast turn, and we'll put it through the opening of the tube, and when it gets all the way through, I'll push in the little piece of wire there that will work itself into the fabric. And when that little wire is through, and I twist it a couple of times, then it will just pull the fabric right in with it. Now it's kind of a good idea if you trim off any of the excess so that it goes through a little bit easier here. So I'm just trimming a slight amount off so that I can pull it through more easily. And you can see what a big glob of fabric I have there, really. See if I can trim off a little bit more. You have to be a little patient. This little gizmo works beautifully, but the fault was with me by having too much fabric there. So once I have it down to a smaller amount of fabric, it will go through that tube, and you can see it's just pulling right through. And when it's through up to the hilt, because I have such a short end there, I'm going to have to untwist the wire and pull it back out. But anyway, it did make a tube very nicely, and anyway, it'll make a nice tie for the end. So this is one thing that I did different from the one that I copied. The one that I saw, I said, had the neckline just done on the serger, and this one I thought, oh, a little bit more finished this way. So if we just look back at this very thin fabric here for a minute, this I said I not only used for underlining under the one blouse, but also I used this for bridal fabric for the overskirts on the bride's formal or her gown. And what you need to do with this, if you're using one layer like this, is experiment. Of course, you're not going to use one layer in a dress. You would use other layers, opaque layers underneath. But any place you have to make a seam, experiment and to see what you have to do. If, for instance, I'm just going to have a machine stitch here on the straight of the fabric, I will have kind of a problem because it ravels dreadfully. And so what I'm going to have to do for this is not just have this one wide seam. I would instead have to also have a little French seam or something if I did it on the straight. Happily, every time I've used this shear on a wedding gown, it has been on the bias because it's been a flared skirt. On the bias, you can press it open and not have any problems. So grain makes a good deal of difference there. Well, you can see all that you're going to have to work with in order to come out with a really nice product as you do these shears, but they are fun. Now, some of these fabrics were used alone and some in combinations with others, and because the terms seem to produce a little confusion, join me next time to find out the difference between interfacing, facing, underlining, interlining, lining, and how to manage all those processes that occur under it all.